There's a sound you only hear after everything else has gone quiet. A small, relentless sound like a clock ticking in an empty room. It is the sound of questions, not the loud ones you ask other people, but the quiet ones that rise from the base of your skull when explanations have run out. What did I miss? What did I do? How did I let this happen? Andrew Cole learned that sound in the space between the locked gates and the first unpaid invoice. He stood in the dimming glow of an industry he thought he understood and realized something painful. His greatest lessons would not come from another degree or a sharper process map. They would come from listening, from unlearning the reflex that told him knowledge was the same thing as wisdom. This part of his life is quieter than the first. It is not about launching machines or signing contracts. It is about the slow, stubborn work of rebuilding a human system, learning to let other people carry weight, learning that leadership is less about answers and more about creating a space where others can think with you. If you expected a comeback story full of headlines and triumphant announcements, this is not that story. This is the opposite. Kitchen table conversations, late-night notes, humbling calls with former staff, lists of small, practical things he finally started doing differently. This is the kind of work that does not look like progress until one ordinary morning the lights come on again and you realize the hum is different because the machine is no longer the only thing moving. So inhale. Lean in. This is the part of the story where the man who broke his company learns how to build something more resilient than steel, a team, a rhythm, a culture. This is part 2. When the doors closed for the last time and the echo of footsteps finally faded, Andrew sat in his home office and listened to a clock he had never felt. The small, insistent tick of questions. He had expected grief, maybe anger, perhaps an explanation to deliver in a neat, formal report. Instead, he found emptiness and the sound of his own decisions pressing in. He had come back to his town with diplomas under his arm and a faith in process. The factory had been a beacon at first, lights, payroll, a column in the local paper. But ambition, when untethered by humility, had real weight. He'd carried that weight like a tool belt, useful but heavy. When the screws began to loosen in procurement, QA, IT, and HR, he tightened the one nut he felt comfortable with in production and assumed the rest would hold. Facing the silence broke him in small ways. He realized that the meetings he skipped were more than calendar holes. They were missed guardrails. The reports he skimmed through were not ceremonial paper. They were early maps of danger. And the faces he mistook for complacency were actually people waiting for permission to act. That night, with a single dim lamp and a blank notebook, he wrote, "Where did I go wrong?" The sentence was a key. It opened his world into an admission he had not allowed himself before. Brilliance without listening is brittle. He did not know how long he would need. He only knew that the sound of the clock would be the brutal but honest drum guiding him toward a different kind of work. Admitting the question was only the first breath. The next step was harder, talking to the people who had already walked away or been forced out. Those conversations had no spectators. They were raw, inefficient, and painfully true. He called Sarah, who had negotiated supplier contracts until her back hurt and her patience wore thin. Her voice on the line was steady but edged. She said things a report never could. We flagged supply chain risks. We suggested staggered vendor terms. You told us to keep production high because the numbers looked good. The numbers looked good until they didn't. He spoke with Lola in HR, who had watched employees shrink until their ideas were tiny enough not to bother him. You rewarded speed but not safety, Andrew. You applauded output and ignored burnout. People left because staying started to feel like shrinking their lives. A QA supervisor, soft-spoken but fierce, reminded him that the reports left in his tray were not pleas but signals. We ran the audits you could have read. We wrote the trends. We asked to meet. The patterns were there. There was no melodrama in these calls, only the steady truth of people who had tried to be faithful to a place and had been cut off by the very heartbeat they helped maintain. For the first time, Andrew heard the other side of leadership, not policy or pride, but the slow erosion that comes from being unheard. He ended the night with a new line in his notebook. I must learn how to listen properly, not to respond, but to change. Andrew decided to go back to school quietly, without fanfare, without the badge of a founder to soften his posture. But this school had no degrees on the line. The subjects were listening, empathy, delegation, conflict navigation, and cultural design. He was a late student sitting in the back of rooms with men and women who'd learned on battlefields he'd never seen. Union negotiations, systems integrations, failing factories that had been turned around. He listened to facilitators talk about the difference between being right and being useful. He took notes on phrases like detect, respond, and psychological safety. He read case studies of companies that built redundancies not as bureaucracy, but as lifelines. He watched videos on leadership humility and watched his own reactions change. The small shifts in posture when someone else finished speaking before he offered a solution, the pause before he corrected to see whether the correction was necessary at all. Humility, he found, was not the opposite of confidence. It was its refinement. It allowed a leader to keep conviction while removing the compulsion to be the sole arbiter. The man who had believed degrees could replace dialogue was beginning to understand that the loudest mind in the room was usually the most dangerous unless it learned how to be quiet. A year after the factory closed, Andrew drove back. It was not a triumphant return. It was a quiet, almost sacred walk through a place that had once carried his voice like a megaphone. The receiving dock smelled faintly of oil and lost plans. The QA lab had dust on the counters, a poster on a notice board. Safety first, drooped at one corner. He stood in the center of the production floor and felt the weight of all the small decisions pile up like a stack of unpaid invoices. The machines looked the same, but the music had stopped because the orchestra had been dismissed. He touched the cold rail with one hand and let the emptiness teach him humility. The man who had once thought that knowledge made him untouchable now felt very human and small in all the right ways. He had been a good technician of systems. He had not been a good gardener of people. On the drive home, he allowed himself to feel regret without collapsing into self-pity. Regret became a practical teacher. It taught him what questions to ask and to whom. It taught him that admission is not surrender. It is a platform for repair. Back at his kitchen table, Andrew drew a new blueprint, not of conveyors and tolerances, but of roles, rhythms, and redundancies. He sketched a system that didn't depend on his presence. He mapped meeting cadences, report cycles, escalation paths. He wrote rules that required no heroism, rules that asked for accountability, not idol worship. Hire leaders, he wrote. Then get out of their way, measure what matters, and meet to prevent, not to panic. Those lines steadied him. They were not grandiose, they were practical. They were the opposite of the quick fixes he'd favored before. This blueprint was modest in ambition, but crooked with courage. It dared to suggest that real leadership isn't about standing taller. It's about making space for others to rise. And as Andrew looked at it, he realized something simple, but profound. This wasn't a plan to save a company overnight. It was a plan to rebuild trust, stability, and strength, one deliberate decision at a time. If the first company had been centered on him, the next one would be centered on others. Andrew spent months recruiting people who were not mirrors of himself, but counters to him. The exact expertise he lacked and the temperament he needed. Calm operational commanders, meticulous finance minds, HR people who built trust, procurement experts, methodical QA leads, and a young but brilliant IT manager who loved tidy systems. He found Evelyn, a managing director who carried order like an instrument. Mid-40s, short natural hair, charcoal suit, eyes that measured both risk and possibility. He hired Alex, a finance lead who made balance sheets sing, Latinx, precise, composed. Vivian, quiet and fierce, took HR with a tenderness that felt like discipline. Daniela handled procurement with surgical clarity. Peter returned quality to its ritual. Marcus planned technology that would stop being reactive and start being predictive. And Sheila, the business reporting analyst, shaped raw numbers into insight, building the data structures and reporting patterns that finally allowed the company to see itself clearly. Their first meeting was simple and honest. They did not need a founder to tell them what to do. They needed a founder to let go. He told them, "We will build differently. You will lead. I will listen. We measure and we meet. We save the small things before they become storms." They nodded. That nod, small and decisive, was the first currency of trust. Their first cross-functional meeting had an odd rhythm for Andrew. The room felt full of other leaders' voices. Evelyn set the agenda. Alex walked through cash flow scenarios with calm measurements. Vivian recommended a staff development cage that prioritized conversations over targets. Peter detailed QA checks and early warning metrics. Marcus proposed an ERP pilot mapped to low-risk lines. Andrew sat at the side. He did not need to speak to validate the plan. He needed to listen to be certain it would hold. And as the conversation unfolded, it did. The team did not offer him solutions as much as they offered him lines of capacity he hadn't known he should be asking for. At the end of the meeting, someone cracked a joke. The room relaxed. For Andrew, the relief was different than applause. It was the lightness of a man who could accept advice without feeling diminished. In that moment, he realized leadership could be lighter and perhaps stronger when shared. Momentum returned like weather. It did not bang on the door. It moved in, rearranged everything, and made the air clear. The first contract after the relaunch felt different. Not celebratory, but steady. The suppliers who had once turned cautious now saw a pattern of punctual payments and clear expectations. The workforce came back not because of promises, but because of policy, because managers now had the authority and the time to manage. Not everything was fixed. Old habits creep back into corners like shadows. There were Saturdays Andrew wished were still days off. There were targets missed and tense conversations. But the rhythm smoothed the edges. When a machine faltered, the protocol stepped in. When a shipment failed, a pre-planned contingency kicked off. One afternoon, Andrew stood at the overhead platform and watched the floor move with the soft assurance of a place that had found its balance. He felt something that resembled peace, not triumph, but the steady warmth of a problem met early and a team that met it together. Andrew's story teaches us that the loudest measure of competence, degrees, certifications, awards, does not protect a leader from blindness. The most brilliant mind cannot replace the soft discipline of listening. It teaches that departments are not boxes you check off when convenient. Procurement, QA, HR, IT, they are not optional layers, they are load-bearing walls. Treat them as side tasks and the whole building tilts. It teaches that meetings are not rubber stamp inconveniences. They are the small bridges that stop you from falling. Reports are not ceremonial. They are whispering warnings. If you let a report sleep in a tray long enough, it becomes a surprise very few leaders survive. And perhaps the most painful lesson, people don't leave companies for paper reasons. They leave for human ones. They leave when a leader's absence in the small things becomes a constant. They leave when their skill is underused, their warnings unheeded, their well-being unattended. But there is a final lesson, bright and saving. Failure can teach, if you will let it. Andrew's collapse could have been his endpoint. Instead, he chose the longer, harder path, to be rebuilt by the very truths he once ignored. He walked, studied, listened, hired, and arranged the rhythms that made the work sustainable. Leadership, he learned, is not a crown. It is a scaffold. It is something you stand on to lift others. It is an invitation to make space for truth. That is what he rebuilt, and that is what quietly saved the company. If you lead someone, one person, a small team, dozens, hear this and copy it. Listen more than you speak. Make meetings into prevention, not punishment. Read the reports before they become headlines. Value the people whose work keeps the machines useful. And if you ever find yourself in an empty factory hall, let the silence do its work. Let it teach you. Then get up and start building again, with people, not alone.